My name is Celeste. I am 34 years old and I live in Charleston, South Carolina. I'm going to tell you something that happened to me and my family 6 years ago during the passage of Hurricane Mateo. Since that day, I've never been the same person. I had never felt real fear until that happened. To this day, I can't sleep properly without remembering that moment, that sound, that feeling of being trapped. That year, the alerts about the hurricane were everywhere. Mateo had intensified in an absurd way, and meteorologists said it could be the worst in decades. My husband Eric has always been cautious, so he insisted that we go to our underground shelter in the backyard. It was one of those old ones, built in the 50s, reinforced to withstand tornadoes and hurricanes. It was small but spacious enough for the three of us, Eric, our 7-year-old son, Ben and me. We took supplies for 3 days, flashlights, a battery-powered radio, and some blankets, expecting that at most we'd be there for one night. At first, everything seemed fine. The shelter was cramped but safe. We could hear the howling winds and things breaking outside. The radio still picked up some stations reporting the tragedy, the evacuation warnings, the number of houses destroyed. Inside, time seemed to drag, and the sound of the hurricane was deafening. The shelter would tremble from time to time, and I held Ben, trying to calm him down. It was a long night, but eventually the noise started to fade. We waited a few more hours until everything seemed calm. But the door wouldn't open. At first I thought it was just the weight of the debris blocking it from the outside. Eric tried to force it, pushing with his shoulder, but nothing. It didn't give even an inch. The latch turned, but it was as if someone was holding it tightly from the other side. Panic started to set in. We tried to reach out via the radio, but there was only static. The air in the shelter suddenly felt heavier. I tried to stay calm for Ben's sake, but my heart was pounding. Eric kept trying to open the door, while I fiddled with the radio, looking for any signal. That's when we heard the voices. First, a faint crackling, then some scattered words, drawn out. It wasn't a normal transmission. It sounded wrong. The voice came through distorted, as if it were being pulled underwater. It said things that made no sense, broken phrases, and then it said my name. Celeste. I froze. It was impossible. How could it know my name? My first instinct was to turn off the radio, but my hand was shaking so much I could only lower the volume. Eric looked at me with the same terrified expression. We tried to convince ourselves it was just interference, maybe someone calling for another Celeste, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Minutes later, the radio made a loud crackling sound and a new voice appeared. This time it sounded closer. It was a low, rasping whisper, like someone speaking very close to the microphone. "Don't go! Don't go!" The shelter went silent. I could feel my own pulse pounding in my head. Eric, trying to stay rational, said it must be a survivor, someone trying to warn us about something. But why speak like that? Why use that voice? That's when we heard it outside. Footsteps, slow dragging, circling above us. But the ground should still have been covered with debris, right? Who would be walking out there in that state? I was frozen. The footsteps came and went, as if whoever was out there was watching us, waiting. Suddenly, Ben started crying. I hugged him tightly, trying to silence him. The radio crackled again, and a new phrase came through, cut off by the noise. He is listening. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed one of the flashlights and started banging on the door, shouting for help. Eric pulled me back, covering my mouth. But then the noise outside stopped. Silence. For a moment I thought it had gone away, but then came the sound. Something scraping on the outside, like nails slowly dragging across the metal of the door. I shuddered. Eric grabbed Ben's arm and pulled me to the back of the shelter. The sound continued until there was a single sharp knock on the door. Then nothing. We stayed there, curled up, for hours. We didn't sleep. We didn't speak. The radio stayed on, but it was just static now. The air felt heavier with each passing minute. I felt like if we stayed there any longer, something terrible would happen. We tried to ration the food and water, but the anxiety made it hard to keep track of time. The air was becoming suffocating, and Ben started complaining that he felt dizzy. The radio gave another crackle, and this time, the static was louder. One last message came through, almost inaudible in the noise. It's too late. At that point, I started to cry. Eric was holding my hand tightly, but he was trembling too. This wasn't normal. The radio shouldn't have been transmitting anything but emergency channels, but it seemed like something was trying to communicate with us. And then, out of nowhere, we heard something completely different. Voices. But this time, human. People shouting names, banging on debris, calling out for survivors. Eric ran to the door, shouted, banged, and then the door opened. Outside, the world was destroyed. Fallen trees, debris everywhere, but there was no one around. No rescue teams, no neighbors, no sign of anyone who might have opened the door. The sky was grey, but there was no wind, no sound of sirens, only silence. We cautiously descended from the shelter, looking around. We picked up Ben and started walking through the destroyed yard. The street was covered with rubble, but in the distance we saw other people coming out of their homes. Everything seemed normal as it could be. But something still didn't make sense. The police and rescue teams arrived about an hour later. They asked if we were okay, if we needed medical attention. We reported that we had been trapped in the shelter, that we couldn't open the door. One of the firefighters looked at the structure and then stared at us with a strange look. "The door wasn't locked," he said. Eric and I exchanged glances. It didn't make sense. We had tried to open it. I had banged, screamed. I saw the latch turn and not give. So what kept us inside? Since that day, we've avoided talking about it, but sometimes at night I still turn on the radio. And occasionally, between the static, I hear the same raspy voice whispering, "Don't go." My name is Gideon. I'm 35 years old, and I live in a small town in Florida. The story I'm about to tell happened a few years ago, during one of the most devastating hurricanes to ever hit the region. I've heard about these kinds of phenomena before, but I never imagined I would experience something like this. What happened that night had nothing to do with the hurricane. It was something much worse, something I still can't explain. When the hurricane alert was issued, my father immediately put our emergency plan into action. He's always been a cautious man, the type who thinks of all possible scenarios. Years earlier, he had built an underground bunker at the back of our property. It was a reinforced place, designed to withstand any kind of natural disaster. It wasn't big, but it had enough space for our family, my father, my mother, my younger brother, and me. We went down to the bunker around 6 p.m. when the wind started picking up. Once inside, the feeling was one of safety, or at least it should have been. As soon as we entered, I felt that something was off. The atmosphere in the bunker was heavy. I can't explain it any other way, but it felt like the air was denser down there. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just my imagination, but I noticed that my mother seemed uneasy too. She kept glancing at the corners of the bunker, as if she was sensing something. My brother, who was only 12 at the time, started getting nervous out of nowhere. He couldn't sit still and said he felt weird. My father, ever the pragmatist, told him it was just the pressure of the storm and that we would get used to it soon. He was wrong. Things started getting strange soon enough. First, there were the sounds. The bunker was well insulated, so we shouldn't have been hearing anything other than the storm raging outside. But we began to hear small popping noises, like someone was walking on the concrete ceiling. I tried to rationalize it, thinking it might be branches or debris being blown by the wind, but the sound was rhythmic, like very light steps, almost deliberate. Then came the whispers. At first, they were so faint they were almost imperceptible. My mother asked if anyone else had heard them, and my father said it was just the wind, but it wasn't. Things escalated when my mother screamed in fright. She was near the shelf where we kept some supplies and said she felt something touch her shoulder. When I looked at her, her face was as white as a sheet. My father tried to calm her down, saying it must have been a strand of hair moving with the wind that came through the ventilation. But my mother wasn't convinced, and frankly, neither was I. Something was wrong in that bunker. The first major incident came soon after. We were all sitting at the folding table trying to eat when the chair next to my brother moved on its own. It wasn't a hard shove, but it was a slow, deliberate motion, like someone had pulled it back. We all froze. My brother started crying, my mother covered her mouth with her hand, and my father tried to stand quickly, but hit his knee on the table in the process. The bunker was silent. Then we heard something. It was a sigh, low but close. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The sound didn't come from any of us, and I knew that because at the moment we heard it, we were all completely still. I looked around, expecting to see something, but the bunker was the same. The only difference was the overwhelming feeling that we weren't alone. Things only got worse as time went on. The bunker started to feel smaller, suffocating. My father kept trying to stay calm, but I could see the way his hands trembled. He had always been a skeptic, but even he couldn't explain what was happening. My mother began praying softly. I had never heard her pray like that before, with so much fear in her voice. It wasn't until the next day that I started putting the pieces together. I couldn't sleep, so I grabbed my phone and looked up anything I could find about the area where our bunker was built. I didn't expect to find anything, but I ended up coming across an old article from a local newspaper. It talked about the land, and that's when I learned the truth. The land where we were, that patch of earth where my father had built the bunker, was once an old Native American cemetery. A cold chill ran up my neck. The article mentioned that many years ago the city had moved the remains to build homes in the area. But according to some witnesses from that time, not all the bodies had been exhumed. Some were still buried there beneath the soil. The article said that, over the years, some people had reported strange phenomena in the area, but no one really took it seriously. I wanted to tell my family, but I didn't know how. Then, as if the bunker itself had noticed my discovery, things escalated even further. The smell inside the bunker changed. It used to have the scent of damp concrete, of mildew. But suddenly, it started smelling strongly of freshly disturbed earth, as if someone had just dug into the floor. My brother began having panic attacks. He said he saw shadows moving, that he felt something touch his leg when he tried to sleep. My mother also started seeing things. She told me that at one point she saw a figure standing at the far end of the bunker, just watching us. My father tried to deny it, but I could tell by the look on his face that he was scared too. By the last night before we left the bunker, things reached their peak. Something knocked on the bunker door. But it wasn't the wind. It couldn't have been. It was a firm, rhythmic sound, like someone was trying to get in. My father grabbed a flashlight and went to the door, but when he opened it, there was nothing there. Just darkness and the sound of the storm in the distance. After that, we simply couldn't stay there anymore. As soon as the hurricane subsided, we left the bunker and never went back. My father tried to sell the property a few years later, but no one wanted to buy it. The bunker is still there, abandoned, and I've never gone back inside. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. If it was something supernatural, disturbed spirits, or if it was all just a product of our own fear. But I know I felt something down there. Something that didn't want us there. And whatever it was, it's still down there. Waiting. My name is Travis Holloway. I am 42 years old, and I live in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm going to tell you something that happened to my family 25 years ago during Hurricane Floyd in 1999. I was never one to believe in these things, but what we experienced in that house still haunts me to this day. I've tried to rationalize it, I've told this story to friends, but no one can explain it. And the worst part is that every time I think about it, I feel that same chill running down my spine. At the time, my father had a friend named Bill who offered us his beach house as a refuge from the storm. He said the house was sturdy, built to withstand hurricanes, and far from the chaos of the coastal cities. To my mother, who was terrified at the idea of staying in town, it seemed like a good option. We got in the car and drove to the coast of North Carolina. We arrived just before the storm really began. It was a large house, somewhat isolated, with an ocean view and surrounded by a dense forest. The structure seemed solid, but at the same time, something about it made me uneasy. As soon as we entered, I felt something strange, but I thought it was just the gloomy weather, the wind whistling through the window cracks. My younger sister, Emily, was restless and clung to my mother. The house had a strange smell, a mix of mold and something I couldn't identify. The walls were thick, but everything about it seemed old, worn down in a weird way. Even so, we lit the fireplace and tried to settle in. My father locked all the doors and said we would be safe there. It was our shelter, our protection against the hurricane. When the wind got stronger, the electricity went out and we had to light candles. That's when we started noticing strange things. First, we heard a noise upstairs. It sounded like someone moving a heavy piece of furniture. My father grabbed the flashlight and went to check, but he found nothing out of place. Then, the kitchen door opened by itself. My mother thought it was the wind, but there was no draft anywhere inside the house. Emily started crying, saying she didn't want to stay there anymore. My father calmed her down, saying it was just the storm outside, but I knew something else was happening. The air was dense and heavy, as if the house was breathing along with the storm. Outside, the storm roared. The thunder made the walls tremble, and the rain pounded against the windows like it wanted to get in. The fireplace crackled, and I tried to focus on its warmth, but I felt a constant chill. My mother said she was hearing whispers, but my father thought it was just the wind passing through the cracks. Then we heard the footsteps. This time they were clear, like boots on the wooden floor upstairs. My father grabbed a fire poker and went up again. I stayed downstairs, nervous, not knowing what to expect. He took longer than usual to come back. When he finally appeared on the stairs, he was pale, as if he had seen a ghost. "There's nothing up there," he said, but his voice was trembling. The feeling of unease grew, and I started to think my mother was right, that something was wrong with that house. The night dragged on, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. With each lightning flash, the house seemed colder, emptier. The worst part was when my mother found the papers in the basement. She was looking for extra blankets and candles when she found a bunch of old documents inside a drawer. They were medical records. The name at the top read, Blackwater Psychiatric Institute. The papers were yellowed, but you could still read the diagnoses, the admissions, and the deaths. The house had been built on the remains of an old psychiatric hospital. The patients had been transferred when the building was shut down, but some never left. The thought of being in a place where so many had suffered made me uneasy, but the worst was yet to come. It was a low, dragging sound coming from somewhere near the stairs. My mother froze. My sister started screaming, saying she saw someone in the hallway. I turned quickly, and for a second, I swear I saw it too. A shadow, motionless, standing by the door. But when I blinked, it was gone. My father ordered everyone to go down to the basement and lock the door behind us. We stayed there, in silence, listening to the noises upstairs. Slow footsteps, as if someone was walking back and forth. Fear was written all over our faces, but no one knew what to do. The tension was unbearable. The storm outside kept growing stronger, and we were trapped there, in the basement, not knowing what was happening above. It was as if time had stopped. We sat in silence, waiting for morning to come and for this nightmare to be over. But the hours passed slowly, and the sound of footsteps never stopped. I was desperate, my heart pounding so hard it felt like the whole house could hear it. I couldn't understand why we were being haunted by this. What was up there, walking back and forth? Who, or what, was trying to warn us? We stayed there until dawn. When the wind calmed and the sun began to rise, we left the basement. The house looked the same, except for one thing. All the chairs in the living room were turned upside down, as if someone had done it on purpose. My father didn't want to talk about it. He just grabbed our things and said we were leaving. The road was covered with branches and debris, but we managed to get back home. We never spoke of that place again. We never went back. Years later, I tried to research the Blackwater Institute. I found out that it really existed and was shut down in the 1960s due to poor conditions. Some patients were relocated, but others disappeared from the records, as if they had never left. I never found an explanation for what happened that night. All I know is that even today, when I hear loud thunderstorms, I feel that same chill down my spine, like something is still watching me. When I think about that house, I remember the strange smell, the doors opening on their own and the footsteps upstairs. I don't know if it was something supernatural or just the hurricane playing tricks on our minds. What I do know is that even 25 years later, I still get chills every time I pass by an old, isolated house near the coast. Maybe what happened that night was a mix of fear and paranoia, or maybe it was something real, something we still don't understand. All I know is that something is there, waiting, and I never, ever want to go back to find out what it is. My name is Nolan, I'm 42 years old and I live in Savannah, Georgia with my family. This happened a few years ago during a hurricane that seemed to be tearing everything apart. I was with my wife, Amanda, and our two small children, Lucas and Sophia. When the hurricane approached, the entire city went into panic mode and we decided to lock ourselves inside our home as it was located in a higher area with a good shelter. Little did we know what awaited us. Everything seemed normal at first. The rain pounded against the windows and the wind made the tree branches creak. The sense of security we felt inside quickly disappeared. Not because of the hurricane, but because of something stranger, something happening inside our home. I was sitting on the couch, trying to calm the children and keep my mind occupied. Amanda was in the kitchen, doing her best to prepare something warm. That was when I noticed something about the mirror in the living room. That mirror had been there since we bought the house, an old wooden relic that we always found beautiful but never paid much attention to. However, that night, the way it reflected things seemed wrong. The images were not as sharp as they should have been. The shadows seemed deeper, the colors distorted. At first I thought it was just the dim lighting and the weather outside, but as I stared at it longer, I realized the distortions were not natural. The feeling of unease grew. The reflection in the mirror did not just reflect what was in the room, it seemed to show something else. As if the mirror was revealing another world, a parallel world, but one that was dark and oppressive. I stood up and walked closer, trying to understand what was happening. That was when I saw something that sent a chill down my spine, a figure moving in the reflection. It was an indistinct silhouette, but I knew something was wrong. Something was not right with that mirror. When Amanda came into the living room, I quickly tried to explain what I was seeing, but she looked at the mirror and saw nothing unusual. This made me doubt my own perception until something else happened. A sound, faint and distant, came from the mirror, like someone whispering. The feeling that we were not alone in the house grew stronger. The children began to cry, disturbed by the atmosphere. Sophia, always calm, asked in a frightened voice, "Who is that man in the mirror, Daddy?" At that moment I knew I was not losing my mind. I was seeing things, yes, but those things were real. Amanda, still skeptical, looked at the mirror again, and for a brief moment the reflection changed completely. The figures in the mirror moved faster, and one of the shadows seemed to stare directly at us. The feeling of dread was indescribable. I grabbed my wife and children and tried to leave the room, but each time we stepped away, the reflection in the mirror became more intense. It was as if the mirror had a will of its own, trying to keep us there in its oppressive presence. We spent hours locked in the bedroom, with the hurricane roaring outside, but the fear of what we were experiencing inside the house was even more overwhelming. We tried to ignore it, but that mirror seemed ever present, invading our thoughts. Even when we closed our eyes, I could still visualize the figures in the mirror, as if they were trying to reach us. Only after much resistance did we manage to sleep, but it was a restless and disturbed sleep. The worst was yet to come. The next morning, the distortions in the mirror had worsened. Now they were visible not just to me, but to everyone. The figures looked more defined, and their faces, though blurred, carried immense sadness and rage. Amanda, desperate, started searching for something that could explain what was happening. That was when, flipping through some old notes left by previous homeowners, we discovered a terrifying story. The mirror had belonged to a man named Gideon Blake, who had died tragically. According to the records, the mirror was cursed. The lost souls that the man had trapped in his attempts at revenge were still inside, reflecting their torments to anyone who came near. The figures we saw were tormented souls, twisted by their anger and suffering, trying to reach the real world, perhaps to seek vengeance on anyone who approached. I went to the mirror again, trying to understand what to do. The figures were more intense now, almost as if they had noticed that we knew about the curse. The hurricane was still raging outside, but the noise of the storm seemed muted compared to the growing sensation that something was coming for us. I decided it was time to leave, But when I tried to move the mirror, a sharp, almost unbearable sound came from it, as if the house itself was screaming. What happened next was so bizarre that I barely processed it. My family and I ran out of the house, heading for the car, with the storm beating against our faces. I looked back, and for a brief moment I saw the mirror reflecting our escape. But instead of showing reality, I saw the distorted souls trying to follow us, their eyes fixed on us. I had never felt such terror in my entire life. We were being chased by something we did not understand, something beyond our comprehension. The hurricane passed, and by some miracle we survived. But even after all these years, the mirror and the images it reflected continue to haunt me. The house was sold after we left, but I never forget the feeling that something is still there, something trapped waiting to be set free. I don't know if the mirror is still there, but I have never been able to look at it the same way again. Now, every time I pass by an old mirror, I feel the chill of what we saw that night, and I wonder, are those souls still there, waiting for their next victim? We never returned to that house. We moved to another place, but whenever it rains, the wind howls, and the night turns eerily quiet, I find myself thinking about the mirror, about what it reflects, and about the souls trapped inside it. I still hear whispers, and sometimes at night, when I look into any mirror, I get the feeling that they are there, waiting to find us again. I know this may sound crazy, but the fear of seeing those figures again haunts me to this day, and I believe they never truly leave. Maybe they're just waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves once more.